Welcome to this session of organizational behavior. Today we will be talking about communication. In this session, our objectives are to cover different types of communication, the definitions of different types of communication, and then we will compare and contrast communication in smaller group networks and in the Grapevine, the interpersonal communication. And then we will also look into the ways communication can have different effect in organizational behavior, and at the same time how the managers should look for the potential problem with different aspects of communication and how can they get over those and can effectively motivate the workforce they're assigned to. According to the book, communication serves 4 major functions within a group or organization. The book talks about control, motivation, emotional expression, and information. So in the next several slides, we will try to explain all these 4 major functions of communication. Communication acts to control member behavior in several ways. Firstly, organizations have authority, different hierarchies, and formal guidelines that the employees are required to follow, and that's formal communication. And at the other hand, we have informal communication that also controls behavior, but here the groups, the people within the groups, work groups and work teams can communicate in a different ways. In an extreme example, if the members are teasing or harassing a certain one member, then definitely it can have negative and not so productive effect on the team outcome and the whole team environment, and certainly that can have a further negative effect overall in the organization itself. A big function of communication is certainly motivation. Communication helps to clarify employees what needs to be done, what are the ways they're doing it, and what are the ways they can improve their performance. At the same time, communication helps to pass on the information about specific organizational goals and other feedbacks, and it can also help to motivate the workforce and reinforce the desired behavior that the organization requires in order to better perform. And then the other function that communication covers is emotional expression. Certainly, communication helps to for any person. Communication helps to have a release for all the emotional expression and feelings, and that can help to fulfill the social needs as well. And in many cases, what the book showed that for many employees, their work groups where they're working together, communicating, being motivated, working towards a similar goal, their work group is the primary source of their social interaction. So communication definitely has an important role in their life. And then finally, the final function that communication covers is information. And certainly, communication facilitates decision making, and it provides effective information by transmitting the data to identify and evaluate between different choices that the managers and the leaders and the employees need to make while performing certain tasks. This exhibit 11.1 talk about the whole communication process. Here we see that on the left hand side we have the sender, there is a certain message to be sent. Then we are encoding the message depending on what kind of channel we are using it to communicate. If it's a verbal channel, face-to-face conversation, then our thoughts are being transferred to our conversation and being directed towards somebody. If we are talking about emailing somebody, then our thoughts are being transferred through keyboard to certain characters and letters and sentences in certain language, and then we are transferring it through the internet to somebody. And the receiver, who is supposed to get the message, he or she receives it and then definitely decoded the same way based on what kind of channel has been used. Here we also see the presence of noise. The noise is always there when we are talking about disturbance. Noise is talking about disturbance. So we are talking about when, imagine some people are talking, two persons are talking, and there are some other loud noises, then they will have a problem understanding and comprehending each other. Maybe they need to talk louder, or maybe they have to go somewhere else to finish the conversation because of the external loud noise. So that noise during that time certainly is creating some kind of problem for them to have a better communication. Or imagine if we are talking about emails, here the noise can be can come in the shape of slow internet speed, or when the server is down, when there is no connection between two terminals, then definitely the emails are not going. And sometimes we see we get the emails but not the attachments because of the problem along the way where the internet protocols are not working right, and the attachments, the data packets are not reaching the receivers. So whenever these kind of things, so these are the noises there. And whatever happens, the receiver gives a feedback back to the sender about whether or not he or she understood the message sent. So there are different types of communication. The chapter first starts with the downward, upward, and lateral communication. Let's first be focused on downward communication. So it, as the name says, downward communication flows from one level to or a relatively higher level to a lower level. It talks about assigning goals, provide instructions. In most cases actually, downward communication is used by the managers, the leaders, the thought leaders in certain organizations. And then they provide the instructions, they communicate policies, different procedures, and downward communication in an ideal world also needs to explain why the decisions are made and how the employees should comply. And the problem that comes with downward communication is in many cases it's a one-way street. So they are not listening to how the employees are reacting, or the other levels of managers and leaders are reacting to such communication. Hence, there should be a channel, as we have seen in our previous slide, there should be a channel for feedback so that we can make sure that the communication is just not one way and it's interactive. So upward communication, to some extent, yes, ensures interaction, but it's primarily used to communicate from the lower level to the upper level in terms of providing feedback to the managers, inform them about different work progresses, and also communicate the current problems within the workforce. So the interesting thing is, upward communication, whenever it's used, there are certain tips and tricks to make it more effective. We need to make sure that whenever we are using upward communication, that the communication has to be succinct. It should be in all the keywords and headlines, not in big paragraphs. And definitely whenever somebody is doing it, he or she needs to have some actionable items related to those keywords and headlines. So whenever those communications are getting the higher ups attention, we can certainly then elaborate on those to the point. So that's very important. And then the lateral communication talks about between different working groups, different members within a working group or other working groups within certain organizations or between different organizations at the same level among different managers or different certain organizational leadership. It's more horizontal in nature. And in many cases, it cuts through the bureaucracy, it cuts through the red tapes, and definitely it can save a lot of time, and it can be more efficient. But at the same time, it can create some sort of a discrepancy. It can create some sort of a tension within the work diagram. The administration, if somebody or the superiors can think that this person who is working under me is communicating with his or her peer in the other group without going through me, and that certainly may not be taken well by the superior peer leadership. So we need to make sure whenever we are using lateral communication within organization that falls that is externally that is explicitly supported by the mode as a mode of communication by the those organizations themselves. So there are different types of communication. There are different types of networks that can define the nature of communication. And so the book tries to summarize many types of communication within the three different criteria, three different examples. So the first one, we are talking about the chain. Here the chain rigidly follows a formal chain of command. We are talking when we are talking about this network, it actually approximates the communication channels that can be like 3 level within a certain organization. And so if somebody wants to go through somebody, he or she has to go through at least with some one level each to reach somebody. But at the same time, that's between the adjacent 3 nodes. But imagine if in the chain diagram, in the bottom left, if that person wants to communicate with the bottom right person, then definitely he or she has to go through the 3 levels of communication within an organization. On the contrary, at the wheel type of communication, what we are seeing here, there is a certain point, one person, he or she is the center point of all the communication, and it's her responsibility to communicate with others or pass on different information, different data, different analysis. And in many cases, that's a good thing, and in many cases, that's a bad thing. We'll talk more about it in the next slide. And then in the third, we are talking about all channel here. Everybody is talking to everybody. It's very flat. It's very horizontal. There is no hierarchy. We are talking about anybody can communicate with anybody without any sort of medium per se. If we look into the different criteria of these different types of communication, what we'll see is when it comes to speed of communication, the chain is kind of okay. Network wheels definitely can be faster because we just go through one point. That's his or her responsibility, that the person communicates with others. And then all channel is definitely fast because everybody can communicate with everybody. When it comes to accuracy, chain is a relatively higher accuracy with respect to all channel. Same with network wheels, they also have higher accuracy. That's the research that found that because it goes through certain people, he or she has the responsibility, or the certain office has the responsibility to make sure that the informations are correct. But at the same time, when we're talking about accuracy, when in all channel communication, some of the quality of the information can be lost through noise. Now, emergence of leader, when we are talking about somebody taking responsibility about certain communication type, in chain, definitely there are possibilities where we see the intermediate loan, like the intermediate nodes that comes between the other nodes that pass the messages. Definitely that's an important role. Definitely we see the emergence of a leader in networks of wheels, because here there is a single office or an entity that controls all the flow of information. And we do not see that in all channel, because it's more like communication within a self-sufficient groups, and anybody and everybody can talk to any others. So that's something to look into. And then when we talk about member satisfaction, interestingly, all channel is of course a good, the best favorite choice for all the workforce, because it cuts through the bureaucracy, no time loss whatsoever. But and at the same time, when we're talking about network wheels, if we are just depending on certain people or certain office to communicate anything and everything, of course people will not be that satisfied. The other thing the book talks about is a very interesting type of communication network, which is the grapevine. It primarily talks about informal communication network within any group of organization. It deals with rumors. And what we know from our dealings with different offices and organizations is rumors emerge as a response to situations that are very important to us, but we see also the presence of ambiguity, and it also, such ambiguity is causing a lot of tension, a lot of anxieties, and work situations frequently contain these three elements. And whenever there is something like that, this kind of grapevine communication with all these rumors start to flourish, which is certainly not a good thing for any organization. This exhibit 11.4 suggests what are the things we need to do to reduce these negative consequences of rumors. In most cases, there is actually hardly any positive consequences of rumors. And now, definitely, we need to be very transparent. We need to provide all the information. We need to be on the record of whatever we are doing in the office, about certain decisions, about certain strategies, about the way we are coping with maybe certain problems or challenges. And we also need to make sure that the managers, the leaders are explaining their decisions, and just do not use it as a in terms of downward communication. It has to be interactive and it has to be transparent. And we also need to make sure that if we hear some sort of a rumor from somebody in the workforce, we should not punish them for having those information from them. And of course, we need to provide the common message of not spreading any sort of unnecessary information or unfounded information. At the same time, we should not punish somebody for just to share any information that he or she received in the grapevine. And then, as we are talking about, it's always important to maintain open communication channels. Let's share a real life story about this. So, in recent uh, days, what we have seen that there has been several disease outbreaks in many parts of the world. We have seen the disease outbreaks of SARS several years ago, and then also saw the outbreak of Ebola, and then the outbreak of MERS disease. SARS was first started in China, then it spread through Hong Kong to other parts of the world, up to Canada. Vietnam was affected. There are so many other countries who were affected. Ebola was started in the West African countries. Then certainly there have been some patients who died in USA and some other countries. And MERS, that disease started in Saudi Arabia, but then recently we saw a huge outbreak of that disease in South Korea. In these three cases, what we have seen, there have been issues in terms of how people are dealing with the information about the disease information, and how they're dealing the part of risk communication. Have they been transparent? Have those information caused unnecessary panic? Were they truthful about consistent about maintaining open communications, and or did they take any major actions against the people who were spreading rumors? Were they explaining the different diseases to the press, to the lay people who are not who do not have that kind of a biological technical knowledge to understand how the different diseases are being spread? So those actually had huge impact on how those diseases were spread and how the whole world communities and those countries have dealt with it. So these are very critical things to look into. In the next several slides, we are going to talk about different types of communication. We first talked about, in this previous slides, we talked about different networks of communication. So the first most common communication since the dawn of our civilization, human civilization, is oral communication. So, of course, the primary means, this is the primary means of conveying messages, and oral communications can be informal or formal meetings. It can be video conferencing, or it can be telephone conversations. All of those can be formal or informal. Video conferencing can be through Skype, can be through Google Hangout. It can be between different friends. So more and more, as the technology advances, the oral communications and the different modes of oral communications are also becoming ubiquitous, omnipresent everywhere we go. Through Internet of Things, we see different sorts of communication, and those can all be formal or informal. Now, when we talk about written communications, of course, those can be the good old letters. We can also talk about different PowerPoint presentations. We're definitely talking about electronic mails, instant messaging, text messaging, and then again, the huge popularity of social media. So these are some of the key ways people are writing between each other and communicating between themselves. This exhibit 11.5 talks about the allocation of time at work by the managers and different professionals. And here we see in terms of communication, the biggest chunk, 28%, are being spent on reading and answering emails by the managers. So as we can see, a big part is being spent in communication at a professional level. In addition to the oral and written communication, there is, of course, an important factor is nonverbal communication. Here we are talking about different innuendos. We are talking about body movements, the intonations or emphasis that we give to words, facial expressions, and in many cases the physical distance that we have. And in many societies, if not all, body language can convey status, level of engagement, and definitely a person's emotional state. We mentioned physical distance factor in the previous slide. So in many societies, in different societies, different countries, physical distance can come up with different sort of a meaning when it comes to the concept of space. Business, for example, a business-like distance in some European countries can be felt intimate in many parts of North America. Certainly, as the book says, distance may indicate aggressiveness or sexual interest, and at the same time it may signal disinterest or displeasure with something being done or something being communicated. This slide talks about Exhibit 11.6, which reflects the issues that we just mentioned in our previous slides about different intonations and how the use of different untold stuff and those intonations can change the meaning of a simple looking sentence. So certainly this slide and the explanations are worth looking into. This exhibit 11.7 talks about the information richness and comparative analysis of different communication channels. Here we start from the left and talk about the low channel richness medias for communication, where we have less interactivity, less speed, less sort of a direct communication. And as we go on the right, we are talking the best possible thing is to have face-to-face conversation. That's the highest channel richness that one can have, one can ensure. And in between, there are certain different other options that is offering some sort of different applications of communication, of online discussion, live speeches, pre-recorded speeches, so on. But at the same time, what we will see in the upcoming slides also, that not always we will be needing interaction, not always we'll be needing high speed for communication. Our need for effective communication depends also on the what sort of information we want to convey. What is the goal behind such communication? We'll detect and we'll devise and decide on the sort of a communication mode we are going to choose in the workplace. This slide explains the thing that we just mentioned in explaining the exhibit of comparative analysis of different richness of channels in communication. Then in addition to the oral communication, we talked about nonverbal communication, and then the other thing we definitely also covered written communication. So when we talk about written communication, and obviously we are looking into comparative channel richness, letters is a very interesting thing to look into. Previously, before the age of audiovisual media, letters, handwritten letters were the way to communicate, and then there came the telegrams, then the telephone, and then the other audiovisual stuff. But nowadays, when we are talking about writing letter to each other, we are predominantly using emails. But in many cases, what we have seen, there are certain pitfalls with emails when we are looking for professional communication. There is always the risk for, like, in a technical way. If I now put on my engineer hat, we'll see that technically IP communications in many cases are not guaranteed. So emails can be lost. Emails are not the most safest of communication that can ensure that the sender will be receiving the same message the sender will be sending the same message the receiver will be receiving. So there can be certain issues with it. So there are risks for misinterpretation and misrepresentation. There can be fallout from the negative messages, and in many cases, of course, there are issues with privacy too. Not only the messages may not be delivered, those can be on the way be hacked by third party or somebody who can have some sort of other bad usage, negative usage of those. And in many organizations for the formal communication, even though it's increasingly we see the absence of it, many organizations still think that it's not that professional to communicate through emails of those important letters, or there has to be some sort of a seal printed and handwritten sign, stuff like that. But at the same time, then we are talking about this internet generation of businesses, the people who are growing up as digital natives, and also the latest versions and the latest batch of digital migrants. We are talking about instant messaging, text messaging, the use of social media, the use of blogs for different sort of communication, and in many ways the lines could not be drawn about what is a formal way of communication and what is an informal way of communication. For example, personally, in my case, I always prefer not to have any sort of a communication, formal communication, work communication in my Facebook account. Now, it's me, but it's not true with others who are in my network. So in many cases, increasingly what I'm seeing is that people started using the messenger version and sending me important stuff in my Facebook. I keep telling them not to do that. That's not secure. In many cases, that's not professional. But as I see, it's changing. So we are actually facing a more blurry situation of formal and informal communication. We sort of talked about the concern with privacy in the email communication. Increasingly, it's getting to be everybody's headache, because more and more we are depending on the cloud-based services. Imagine most of us have Google services, the Gmails, or the different social networks, and Dropboxes. We're using Dropboxes or many other stuff. So a big part of our life, a big part of our professional and personal information, documents that we are sharing efficiently with anybody that we find important, or everybody within our certain networks, are in the cloud, in the network space, in the internet. And those can have valid privacy concern if we are not using secured network. And even after we are using secure network, we have seen instances where there have been major security breaches in all the big companies, and certainly people can feel vulnerable. So that's one thing when we are talking about privacy, we're talking about information security, about communication. The other thing, increasingly what's happening is most of the companies monitor employee internet use. They are also looking into email records. There are video surveillances and phone records. And of course, as individuals, we can raise concerns about it. Why are we going towards a big brother approach here? And what kind of surveillance is good? What kind of surveillance is bad? So if increasingly these different organizations are facing these questions, they're facing these concerns, and so an ideal way to deal with this is to engage the employees in the creation of information security policies, giving them some control over how their personal information should be used, things like that. Personally, in one of my previous workplaces, I volunteered myself to write e-communication policy. There was none, and there were certain issues with that university on dealing with the emails, and there have been also complaints against the network administrators that they're reading somebody else's emails. So we came up with some sort of email policy based on other organizations, and the whole community, university community, was involved there. They were vetted for this policy implementation, formulation and implementation. So that's definitely something, definitely one of the examples that the people should consider when we are looking for we're looking for to have a leeway from this concern of privacy, at the same time security. Now, when we communicate something to somebody, how the people are processing, or somebody is passing on certain messages to us in order to communicate, how we are processing those information. Those things are explained in the chapter through automatic processing and control processing. So first, let's talk about automatic processing. It talks about relatively superficial consideration of evidences that we have on certain information that is passed along to us, and automatic processing takes little time and low effort, and so it makes sense to use it for processing persuasive messages related to topics that we don't care much about. But the problem with such automatic processing is that it lets us be easily fooled or motivated or take rash decisions by a variety of tricks and different things. Like we can just come up with, oh, I am deciding on this because the model is attractive, or the car that is used it's very good. I would like to have a car like that thing because the color is attractive, things like that. So those are the things happens when we are engaged in automatic processing of any sort of communication. And then comes the control processing. Suppose we are looking for a place to live. We're looking for our future home. So definitely, it's not something our seeming attraction to certain models or the background of certain colors is not going to cut it. Definitely, we are going to look for extensive research. We are going to talk to our peers. We are going to talk to different experts about buying a house, and then we will also look into different tax rates and other issues, other possibilities, securities, and then the mortgages and the resale value, things like that. So that's more like we are processing this in a controlled way that requires effort and energy. But at the same time, it takes a lot of time to do certain things. But definitely, control processing, when we do it, we have better chance of not to be fooled by any sort of communication. Now, there are few rules of thumbs to determine what type of processing is needed by an audience and what type of processing they will be involved in when certain type of communications are thrown out to them. One of the best predictors of that is of whether the people will use an automatic or a controlled process for reacting to a persuasive message is their level of interest in it. When people are very much interested in the outcome of a decision, they're more likely to process information carefully, as we have seen in our previous slide. So people who are very well informed about certain subject area, they are most likely to use control processing strategies. On the other hand, who are poorly informed about a topic, then definitely they will be looking for some superficial arguments presented, and they can be deceived by it. So that's a higher chance of for those kind of people to do that. So the other stuff is very important is whether or not we have prior knowledge behind this. So if we have a better knowledge, better experience about certain similar type of communication, similar sort of issue, then definitely people will tend to apply those knowledge more. Then definitely we should also be looking into the personality of certain people that those who are being communicated. So a personality trait of individuals, if imagine that those people do not have the personality of concentrating on something important, and they can be easily deviated to others, then sure, I think at that for that crowd, its automatic communication process can be used. The other stuff that influences whether people use an automatic or controlled processing strategy is the characteristics of the message itself. Messages provided through relatively lean communication channels, when we're talking about with little opportunity for the users to interact with the content of the message, then the people tend to encourage automatic processing. That kind of thing actually encourages automatic processing by the users or by the recipients. Conversely, messages provided through richer communication channels, for example, by a long magazine article, by an essay, or a long video. But then, in the real life, what we all experience is that there are many barriers to effective communication. First one, there are several ones. We are talking about filtering, selective perceptions, lying, silence, language, and so on. So let's first talk about filtering. It refers to a sender's purposely manipulating information so it will be seen more favorably by the receiver. So in many cases, we will see in our offices that people, our co-workers, are talking to our superiors and giving them the messages or the communications, whatever the superior officers or our managers want to hear. So we are filtering stuff. So that is definitely not a good practice. That definitely put a lot of hindrance in effective communication. A selective perception is something that we talked about in our previous sessions. This is a personality trait where the receivers who are where the communication is going, selectively see and hear based on their needs, based on their motivations, based on their performances, experience, background, and personal biases that they have. So based on that, they will keep. So that's also sort of a filtering, and that definitely messes up with harms effective communication. Then imagine, I see it all the time, information overload. For example, in the orientation classes or at the university setting or at the orientation of any new workforce in a certain organization, there we are bombarding the newbies with so much of information that at some point they will be just indifferent about it, and they will ignore, they will pass out and forget those information. So yeah, those certainly can create a lot of problem in terms of ensuring effective communications. Then the other thing which is important, and we'll talk a bit about it later, is language. Language is a huge issue. There are many words, many sentences, many uses of sentences. Those that can be understood and perceived differently. In many cases, offensively, but like people can take offense on those sentences in different parts of the world. Now, when we are talking about multinational workforce within certain organization, then definitely we also need to look into our effective use of language. The other more important thing that I have found in these barriers of effective communication is the communication apprehension. There are many people, and the managers should consider that also. Different managers, that there are many people within our workforce who just are not comfortable in communicating with others, who have the anxiety within themselves about whether or not they can ensure better communication. Hence, they keep silent. So that can be their problem. That can be a mental blockage. So managers need to understand those things. The managers need to understand the strengths and the weaknesses of the workforce and work around accordingly, so that we can make sure that effective communication can flow smoothly in the organization. So we talked about culture related to language before. So yes, there are huge cultural barriers when it comes to communication. And those can be in the semantics. The words mean different things to different people. In many countries, for example, in Russia, there are certain things, English terms, for example, efficiency, free market, regulations, those are not directly translatable to Russian language. So then how can one communicate that? And in many cases, the connotations are very important things to look into. For example, the book talks about, like in the Japanese word, okay means yes, but it also can mean yes, I'm listening, but certainly it may never mean yes, I agree when somebody is saying okay. So yes, so that can cause a lot of problem. We talked there are some other related issues with the languages, and then there are also some sort of a difference in receptiveness when it comes to and difference in tolerance in such that can be caused when people are facing communication problems. Some people can be restless and they can be frustrated easily, and that can create some tensions within the working force. And in many cases, people also, we will see highly tolerant people who are looking into the problem and trying to solve it, or waiting things to be solved quietly. So all these factors are part of the cultural barriers, and definitely worth looking into for the managers. This exhibit 11.8 talks about these high versus low context cultures, where higher context we're talking about not just literal meaning of it, the different social stature, different ways of different connotations, different economic status, different organizational status, or cultural issues, all need to be considered when we are communicating. So some things, the same sentence coming up from the chairman of a company and from a low rank manager may not mean the same thing. So high context areas for the countries with high context, that's true. But if we come to the low context countries like the Germans and Switzerland, the North Americans, here the same sentence coming out from a chairman of a company and the low rank manager can be same. So we seriously need to better understand the cultural nuances and contextualize our communication to have and effective working relationship. So cultural guide is definitely needed. We certainly need to make sure that we are clear within ourselves what we want to communicate. Definitely we need to keep an open mind. We should not ever pass judgment when we are communicating at a cross-cultural state, in a cross-cultural scenario. We definitely need to show respect to others. We need to be fair. We need to be democratic. And then if we are in doubt, definitely we need to listen first before we start communicating further. We need to just state facts. We certainly, in many cases, should not communicate our interpretation. Stating facts may be always a good thing. And of course, we need to be open to other person's viewpoint. So what are the things the managers need to remember from this session when we are talking about communication? We are talking about effective communication. We always need to understand that first we need to be clear about our goal, the objectives of our work that we want to, what are the things we want to communicate, and through that communication, what are the things we want to achieve. Based on that, we need to be very smart. We need to be very efficient in choosing the communication mode. That definitely will ensure effective communication. And then we definitely should be open for feedback from our employees, from our peers, from our superiors, so that we know the communications that we are managing, the communications we are doing, we are being part of, are effective, and how we can tweak things around to make it even more effective. And definitely we need to keep in mind the major communication barriers of gender and culture. Thank you.